right, good frosty morning, everybody.
Yes.
Yeah. I was remembering this morning and last night about how it was in July. I think we were having the heat wave, and I thought I was going to melt, spontaneously combust. This morning, I was just glad I didn't see my breath in the air inside. Alrighty, so we are with God sees the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4 in various verses, and we're somewhere around AD 26 through 30 at Sychar. Jesus had left Judea because of the threat of persecution by the Pharisees, and he took not necessarily the normal route to Galilee, but he went to Galilee, and that took him on the route that he took through Samaria. And that's where he would meet the woman at the well, and there was some design, I think, of that journey. Jesus offered the woman at the well in Samaria eternal life, even though she had never met him before. And we're reminded, I think, with that Jesus knows everything about us, all about the internal and external details of our lives, even though we haven't shared them with him necessarily. So he already had completely known her. And his ministry in John 4 prepares the Samaritan region to enter God's kingdom alongside the Jews. Because remember, we're in a new paradigm where everybody's on the bus to heaven. All right, we start with Jesus' arrival in Samaria. Then cometh he to a city of Samaria, which is called Sychar, near to the parcel of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied with his journey, sat thus on the well, and it was about the 6th hour. So Jesus has entered the area of Sychar, and that's an area of Samaria that's pretty rich in religious heritage. And I've got a couple maps in the next couple slides. But Jacob, one of Israel's patriarchs, had a well in the valley between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And Jacob's son Joseph was buried in the nearby town of Shechem. This area had some pretty significant meaning for Jesus' discussion with the Samaritan woman. Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim were important landmarks when Israel entered the Promised Land under Joshua. Per Moses' instruction, half of the nation was to stand on Mount Ebal, where the curses of Deuteronomy 27 were to be spoken. And then the other half of the nation was to stand on Mount Gerizim, where the blessings of Deuteronomy 28 were spoken. And Abraham and Jacob both built altars to worship God in the region, which the Samaritan woman mentions in verse 20, which of course was helpfully skipped over in the readings, but I inserted it back in. But this was not just a simple everyday conversation in passing. Jesus was talking to a woman who needed salvation, and he was preparing the way for his church to reach the Samaritans with the gospel after his ascension. This required Jesus to overcome some obstacles because there was a complicated history of the relationship between the Samaritans and the mainline Jews, and that tension that existed between the two groups could have jeopardized the church's mission in that part of the world. Now, when it says down at the bottom of verse 6 that it was about the 6th hour, the way they measured time there, that meant it was noon, because the day started, I think, at 6 in the morning. Am I correct about that?
The 6th hour.
The 6th hour is military time, I would think.
No. The 6th hour is around noon.
Oh, I don't know then. I'd never seen that.
Yeah, because I'm trying to think. When Jesus died at 3 o'clock, I'm trying to think of what hour that was.
6 in the evening.
Huh?
Shabbat.
No.
Their Sunday starts like Saturday evening sometime. What time is that? 5:30 or 6, something like that?
Sundown. But in the reading, I saw multiple times in the
Yeah,
readings
it's
I was
probably
doing.
right.
Yeah, the 6th hour is noon.
Yeah, we'll have to.
6 hours.
We'll have to look
Okay,
into
so
that.
6th hour is noon.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I saw that several places, so I'm pretty confident with that.
Okay.
And it makes sense without how the story unfolds. But Sychar was a town near the land that Jacob had given to Joseph, and Jesus is stopping at the well to get a drink of water because it's noon, it's hot, he's weary, he's parched, and he travels, but he has a more important purpose. It's not just because he was thirsty. So at any rate, I pulled up a couple maps. Here is Samaria, and it is Galilee's to the north and Judea's to the south. And remember, Jesus is coming from Galilee, and he's coming down to Samaria. In New Testament times, the population of Samaria was mixed with Israelites and foreign settlers, and those foreign settlers were often despised by the Jews. Now, modern day, Samaria is on the west bank north of Jerusalem, but it had been, starting at somewhere around 884 BC, the center of the northern kingdom of Israel. But it was conquered by Assyria in 722 BC, and a lot of the Israelites were deported at that time. And if you look at a little bit more specifically where we are for this week's lesson, Sychar and Jacob's well. Sychar is a distinct place east of Shechem. There was a debate for some time whether maybe Sychar was actually just a mistake and it was actually Shechem, but it's not. And it's Sychar is likely the New Testament name for the modern village of Ascar. And it is slightly about half a mile northeast of Jacob's well, which we see here. Now, Shechem is somewhere here. Just didn't want to add yet another map, but well, there we go. Shechem is about here. It's between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, and Jacob's well is on the right of the road where it bends from the plain that I can't pronounce into the pass of Shechem, and about half a mile off on the edge of the plain is the village of Ascar on the lower slope of Mount Ebal. And then a little to the west is the traditional tomb of Joseph. And the Sychar is the district east of Shechem, and it's usually identified with Jacob's parcel of ground. All right, back to the verses. Jesus' request for water. There cometh a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus saith unto her, Give me to drink. For his disciples were gone away unto the city to buy meat. Now, normally women would draw water at the well during the cooler periods of the day, which would be in the morning or later in the evening, because I don't know if y'all have hauled water around, but water weighs 8 pounds per gallon of water, so it gets pretty heavy pretty quick. So it's pretty heavy, and that's a pretty hard labor task. And plus, if you draw it when it's cooler out, the water itself is going to be a bit cooler. So if you draw it in the morning, it's going to be cooler for at least part of the day. But uncharacteristically, this woman came to the well at noon, where it was hot, the hotter part of the day, and also uncharacteristically a little bit, she was alone. Now, if she had come to the well during the more traditional times of the morning or the evening, there are probably a lot of other women in the community drawing water at that time. But that's not what she did. So here she's alone and says Jesus. And uncharacteristically, again, for a Jewish man, let alone a rabbi, as Jesus was, Jesus spoke to her. Now, traditionally, rabbis in particular would not speak to women in public because they feared what others would think of that they were doing something that hopefully they weren't. But Jesus spoke to her anyway. And we soon learn, that Jesus already knew, that this particular woman had an immoral living arrangement. Now, it's possible that the woman had avoided contact with others because of that. But Jesus was worried about her spiritual well-being, which was a lot more important to him than the current social prohibitions of the time or potential slander to his reputation by speaking to her. Now, Jesus made seemingly an ordinary request. He asked her to draw water with her jar and to let him take a drink from it. Well, here's the catch. This woman was a Samaritan. Jesus was a Jew. And the Jews held a long-standing hatred for the Samaritans, which led them to believe that the Samaritans, especially Samaritan women, were ceremoniously unclean, which was a big deal at that point. But Jesus discounted this unfounded bigotry in the absence of his disciples, who we would talk to about that later. But at this point, the problem was Jesus needed to have a conversation with this woman. So he did. Then saith the woman of Samaria unto him, How is it that thou, being a Jew, askest drink of me, which am I a woman of Samaria? For the Jews have no dealings with the Samaritans. So, given what I just told you, the Samaritan woman was pretty shocked that he was talking to her, and she asked why Jesus would speak to her. Now, Jesus didn't answer directly, but he kind of answered it by continuing his conversation. And that also explained how little social prohibitions meant to Jesus' ministry. Going on, the offer of living water. Jesus answered and said unto her, If thou knewest the gift of God, and who it is that saith to thee, Give me to drink, thou wouldst have asked of him, and he would have given thee living water. So Jesus is shying away from the physical matters and is trying to transition to spiritual matters. And he suggested that there were things that this woman did not know, such as she didn't know God's gift or even the identity of who was talking to her. If she had known, instead of Jesus asking her for a drink, she would have asked Jesus for a drink of living or running water instead of the stagnant water found in the cistern and the well. Had she asked, Jesus would have given it to her. The woman saith unto him, Sir, thou hast nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. From whence then hast thou that living water? Art thou greater than our father Jacob, which gave us the well, and drank thereof himself, and his children, and his cattle? So of course the woman's pretty confused at this point, because she thinks he's talking about the physical matters, and he's really not. He's talking about the spiritual plane. And her confusion was because he didn't even have a jar to dip into the well, and the well was way too deep to get water out any other way. And she assumed that Jesus was talking about ordinary drinking water, because like many, her mind was focused on the earthly, daily, material needs and wants. So she was thinking literally and on the earthly plane, not the spiritual one. Now, as we see in verse 12, her heritage, which was rich and meaningful to her. Now, Abraham's grandson Jacob, who was a respected patriarch in Jewish and Samaritan history both, was credited with providing a well, which was the one that she was drawing water from. And therefore, for Jesus to consider himself to be greater than the revered Jacob was really unthinkable to her. Because she's standing here like, you don't have a pot, you can't draw the water, and who do you think you are? Because she was a little slow on the uptake here. Jesus answered and said unto her, Whosoever drinketh of this water shall thirst again. He's trying to guide her again into a meaningful spiritual discussion, but he knew how to redirect her thoughts and her attention, and he did not allow himself to be sidetracked by responding to the challenge that she had just issued about whether he was greater than the revered Jacob. So he continued to talk about the water he offers. But whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst. But the water that I shall give him shall be in him a well of water springing up into everlasting life. So what he's telling her is the water from the well would only provide temporary relief, whereas the water that he offered her would provide lasting relief so that the woman would not need to return, at least spiritually, to the well repeatedly to receive the water's benefit, because the water Jesus was offering her was eternally satisfying and quenching of all thirst, at least spiritual thirst. Different from the water well, his water is eternally satisfied and quenches all thirst, and it is a free-flowing fountain of water resulting in eternal life. The woman saith unto him, Sir, give me this water, that I thirst not, neither come hither to draw. Now the woman, still misunderstanding Jesus' offer of eternal life and who Jesus actually is, was still thinking literally and of earthly concerns, because she's thinking, well, I don't have to schlep water back and forth. That's going to save me a lot of labor. And, I'd like to not be thirsty anymore. So she liked what she thought Jesus' offer was, but she still didn't understand God's gift that Jesus had mentioned back in verse 10. Jesus saith unto her, Go, call thy husband, and come hither. The woman answered and said, I have no husband. Jesus said unto her, Thou hast well said, I have no husband. For thou hast had 5 husbands, and he whom thou now hast is not thy husband, and that saidst thou truly. I love Shakespeare. So Jesus persevered still in turning the woman's thinking away from earthly concerns to spiritual matters by using practical life issues. He told the woman, Go, call your husband, then come back to the well. Well, slight little catch there. The man she was living with was not her husband. So he's getting her attention. So when the woman answered that she had no husband, Jesus responded that she had answered truthfully. She had been married 5 times, but she was not married to the man that she was currently living with. Now remember, this woman had never met Jesus before, so as far as she was concerned, Jesus had no basis to know anything about her, let alone this particular little kernel of knowledge. The woman saith unto him, Sir, I perceive that thou art a prophet. Because she couldn't think of any way that Jesus would know that information about her, because that was something she probably didn't even advertise in her community, but she couldn't think, unless it was God's insight into her life, that was the only thing she could think of. The only way this man she had never met would know this about her. So she concluded that Jesus had to be a prophet, because to her, that was the only reasonable explanation she had for Jesus to have that knowledge about her. But we see here that the woman is starting to finally start thinking on a spiritual plane. Okay, so at this point, the woman brings up the main religious distinction between the Jews and the Samaritans, which is the place where God is worshipped, and reminded Jesus of the barrier between them. So I'm going to read the skip verses. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and ye say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. Jesus saith unto her, Woman, believe me, the hour cometh when ye shall neither in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem worship the Father. Ye worship ye know not what. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. All right, here's the background. The Samaritans held that God was to be worshipped on Mount Gerizim, where a temple had been built, and Jewish priests who disagreed with the priesthood in Jerusalem had served. But the Jews had later destroyed that temple, but the Samaritans still held firm in their belief that they were supposed to worship God at Mount Gerizim. So they weren't real happy with the Jews tearing down that temple. That's what it amounts to. But the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshippers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father seeketh such to worship him. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. So there, Jesus is circumventing that Jewish-Samaritan barrier and makes the issue personal to this woman. He's focusing on the proper attitude with which to approach worship rather than the proper place to worship God. And he said it's heartfelt devotion to God driven by the spiritual truth and by the indwelling Holy Spirit. It's not, the important part is not that you worship in some kind of community endorsed method. It's really the how, not the where, in other words. So the woman saith unto him, I know that Messiah cometh, which is called Christ. When he is come, he will tell us all things. Now Jesus' response at this point was unusually blunt. He actually did assert his identity as the Messiah to her, despite he's still in his earthly ministry. And he didn't often do that because he didn't want to be mistaken for the powerhouse that the Jews were looking for, that they thought were going to deliver them from and rescue them from the Roman dominion. So he usually didn't say, hey, I am the Messiah. He didn't want them to kind of get sidetracked. But Jesus saith unto her, I that speak unto thee am he. And upon this came his disciples, and marveled that he talked with the woman. Yet no man said, What seekest thou, or why talkest thou with her? So Jesus' disciples, who had missed the conversation with the woman, had returned from their trip to town for supplies, and they were surprised because of their prejudices to find Jesus speaking not only to a woman, but a Samaritan woman. But they didn't have Jesus' insight into this woman's spiritual needs or his opportunity to minister to the Samaritan community. So the disciples were going to still be hindered in their gospel ministry at that point by the cultural and historical pressures because they had not yet seen humanity from God's perspective. All right, wrapping up here. The woman then left her water pot and went her way into the city, and saith to the men, Come, see a man which told me all things that ever I did. Is this not the Christ? So for the woman, her reason for coming to the well to draw water was no longer the most important, pressing thing in her mind. She was in such a hurry to leave and return to the city to spread the word that she left her heavy jug at the well because it would have slowed her down. And she discussed the man that she had met at the well as soon as she returned to the city, and she urged the people to follow her back to Jesus, as he was unlike any she had ever met. Jesus had intimate knowledge of her, both the good and the bad, the past and the present. So Jesus had to have a unique relationship with God in their viewpoint. They did recognize that. And she asked the city folk a very direct question. Can this be the Messiah? And apparently when it was the way it was originally phrased in Greek, it would anticipate a negative answer, but that was not her intent here. She wanted the townspeople to come to their own conclusion about Jesus, kind of reminiscent, I think, of last week's lesson. So yet again, Jesus used his omniscience to make this Samaritan woman consider his true identity and the salvation that he offered. And in response, she pointed others to Jesus by telling them about the profound impact he had on her life. All right, back to my very overly dramatic squirrel. Hadn't seen him for a little bit, so I thought we might revisit. All right, so we see here that everyday activities can provide an opening and a transition into having a spiritual discussion with people. It doesn't have to start out that way. But even spiritual discussions that are not immediately understood as such can still provide a lot of benefit. And if we're willing to receive it, Jesus offers us things that the world can't offer. He knows everything about us, and he can provide what we actually do need, not necessarily what we want or what we think we want, and not necessarily even the material provisions on earth, but he can provide us what we need spiritually. And properly motivated people can prioritize spiritual matters over physical needs once we get out of that mindset. And finally, life transformation, as we see with the Samaritan woman, can lead to bold witness for God. Anybody have anything we can add? Apparently I've been running my chops enough.
Well, this was the opportunity, as the whole lesson is that God knows all, okay?
Mhm.
And he knows where he's going and how he's going to get there. And this was the opportunity for him to introduce, Christ into Samaria, okay? To set the stage for his disciples to go out later.
Mhm.
Because remember, when he first sent the disciples out, he sent them out in twos, and he said, go only to the Jews, don't go to the Samaritans, okay, and the Gentiles. But now he's set in those ways. So
Yeah.
when the disciples go after Jesus is crucified, the disciples get ready to go out, he's already established a path for them to
Yeah.
follow.
Yeah,
Okay?
he carved he started a path into what would have been a very hostile territory.
Yeah.
For them.
And then they really started coming in as it unfolds in Acts, they started coming in, and then they were getting persecuted, and they started moving back out. And then they go to different places and get persecuted, and then they move further, and they get persecuted, and they move till they cover the whole world.
Mhm. So actually the persecution had kind of a sneaky function.
And I guess it says known the world, but at that time what the world was known of, all right?
Yeah. But as usual, Jesus did not necessarily recruit the normal people that we would think. And Jesus didn't hold himself socially, economically, or otherwise above anybody. It was, again, an everybody on the bus. New paradigm. And he was really starting to strike out, I think, here in new ways or new directions in that new paradigm. So, all right. Well, thank you very
Yeah.
much.
He knew it was a hostile world.
Oh, yeah.
Because when he sent the disciples out the first time, he said, take nothing with you, not even a cloak, okay?
Yeah.
And if they don't respond to that and accept you, take your sandals off and knock the dust off, and they will be rejected. And then at the end, he said, when you go out, do you have a sword? And they said, why? And he says, if not, sell your clothes and buy one. All right? And they said, we have two. He said, that'll be enough. All right? So, in his mind, it was, they had the right to protect themselves, all right? Defend themselves in a hostile situation if they had to. That's where they refer back to verses that, for gun laws and stuff like that you have a right to arm yourself, right? In the Constitution.
Just reminds me of Nehemiah when he was rebuilding the city. They had the building utensils in one hand and the sword in the other. That's just how it is.
The ancient CVs.
Yeah.
All right.
Crazy Baptist?
Huh?
I said crazy Baptist.
All right. Well, thank you very much.